Well, welcome back. Well, here's a headline that just crossed the wires. In Hong Kong, zero COVID brings small businesses to their knees. Even here's the subheadline. Small business owners are facing the third year of the pandemic with no clear end in sight to forced closures and curfews. Well, you don't need to go to Hong Kong, for crying out loud, to see small businesses being destroyed by ridiculous COVID restrictions. One of the most important books I think that you and I've read. I was going to say I read it, but you read it. You read it first, and then I read it.
I found it.
You found it, then I read it. Is the book the book called "The War on Small Business: How Government Used the Pandemic to Crush the Backbone of America." And if you've watched our show for any length of time, you know that I think we cite the book like twice a week.
All the time. Yes. I always have my highlights pointed, brought up just for talking points. And yes, I heard the author, Carol Roth, on Tom Wheelwright's show, the Wealthability podcast. And it really changed the way I see talking points from the government. So rather than us continuing to regurgitate this information, we have brought you the author in order to give it to us fresh. And this is her research, and I think it's so brilliant. So thank you so much, Carol, for joining us.
Yeah, Carol, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me and for spreading the word. And please keep spreading the word without me, because we need as many people educating on this topic. One of the biggest stories of the last 2 years, yet nobody's reporting on it. So I appreciate the work that you guys are doing.
I feel like it is the story of our lives right now, because people are looking to governments to make major decisions that affect us all the time. Right now, we're on the precipice of war, and we're trusting that the government is going to do what's right by everyone else. Your book really highlights that the government doesn't do this, and it certainly didn't do it during the pandemic. Something that I really didn't understand before you laid it out so clearly was that the government is in the business of choosing winners and losers, and it likes to choose people around them, people who have bigger businesses that they can control. So small business, the little guy, is the enemy. Is this something you always were aware of, or did the pandemic just bring it home for you?
You know, I wrote a book about 10 years prior to the war on small business called The Entrepreneur Equation. And it was about all of the ways that, it's so difficult to be a small business owner. And certainly, from my experience with small business and writing the book and about all the risks, there are things that small businesses have had to incur for years and years, whether it's anti-competitive legislation, whether it is ridiculous hiring constraints, permits and things that really make it much harder for a small business to get started and then to compete. But never did it really occur to me that the number one risk to a small business could be the government itself, and that risk of them coming and shutting the business down and basically taking away their property and property rights. And in fact, when I went into writing the book, and the assignment from the publisher was just to sort of give a economic take of what happened in this historic moment, while I knew small business was a big story because they were amongst the first to be closed down, they were closed while some of the bigger companies were open and whatnot. It wasn't until I really got into the research that I realized how stark everything was, and kind of came to this ultimate conclusion about decentralization versus centralization.
So it sounds like when you were starting, did you have a thesis when you started this? Because everything was so stinking fluid at that time. Remember, Congress was throwing around this idea that, hey, money, we've got all this money, we're going to throw it at small businesses and big businesses. Everyone's going to be fine. Dogs and cats living together. It was crazy. Did you enter into this with a thesis that you knew what question to ask at the beginning, or did this unfold more organically for you?
No, well, I guess there's sort of two different ways to answer that question. I knew there was going to be an issue around small business. I did an op-ed in early March of 2020. I think it was on Fox Business or Fox News, that talked about, listen, if you're going to even think about shutting down small businesses, here's the way to keep them in business, keep people employed, actually put money to work in a smart way, and buy yourself some time so you can figure out, how we mitigate the risks and move on with our lives. And so, there was a part of me that knew that this was going to be problematic for small business and that there was a way forward. However, in terms of writing the book, I didn't know that that was going to be so central to the overall discussion. I signed up, somewhat naively, saying, "Oh yeah, it'll be very interesting to document, what's going on here economically," not realizing that we would be in this, multiple years later, and that people would be so compliant with it. So I would kind of do some research. Then new information would come out, have to sort of redo that. So I actually wrote about 3.5 different books during the course of the pandemic, each with a different title. And this is sort of where we landed. But there's a lot that wasn't able to be included in the research.
So the media makes it seem like anyone saying that the pandemic infringes my rights or it takes my livelihood away is just like a gunslinging Trumper who is selfish, right? So you really had me hooked with this experience of the hairdresser in Texas, because I did read media about this woman who wanted to reopen her hair salon, but safely. And I thought to myself, well, who needs their hair done? Just stay home. Your hair is just going to grow. Forget it, right? But then you point out that there were other businesses that were allowed to move forward. She was willing to participate with safety regulations, and there was no science behind either getting your dog groomed, but not getting your head groomed. So why do you think the media wants us to believe that anyone who is standing up for their rights is just crazy and selfish?
Wow. I mean, that is such the multi-trillion-dollar question. I feel like what we call sort of the corporate press, in this country, in the United States and around the world, really is running cover for the government. They're the ones that are supposed to be challenging government decisions, and instead, they're best friends, and sort of anything that they say, they'll run cover. And part of the reason I say this, and I lay this out in the book, and I've done this in tweet threads as well, is just their own posturing and changing from month to month on the same information without changes in the science. The mask debate is, the number one area where you can see this flip-flopping and hypocrisy from the media. And it started out when we were all taking measures to protect ourselves and going, we don't know what this is, so maybe a mask might make sense. Back in February and March of 2020, the media was actually saying, don't do this. You shouldn't get a mask. It actually could be harmful to your health. In fact, NBC News in the United States, one of the major outlets, made fun of then President Trump for being focused on masks, saying, he get caught up in these little dalliances, these little side things. And he was saying, well, I don't understand. If it works for a doctor, why wouldn't it work? And they're like, oh, haha, what a stupid idiot. And then a month later, completely changed their position. And this is why people have no trust, is because they have been blatantly lied to. Whichever side you think is the actual truth, the science didn't change. And now we're seeing it all the way today with the story about inflation, where they're saying inflation isn't going to come. It's going to be transitory. Oh, now it's good for you. And then in recent days, CBS News said, oh, inflation is as a result of the Ukraine conflict, which just started. So people just aren't trustworthy, because every time the media says something, it's clear that they're saying it in alliance with a larger narrative, and that they're no longer trying to find the truth and inform the public.
Right. It's very difficult. Sorry, I was going to say, it's very difficult to, on the one hand, be CBS News and do a segment outlining the truth, and then go to commercial break, and half of the commercials are Pfizer or some Tide or some other big corporation that's funding these pursuits, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true. And I think it's the same thing, with the government as it is with these big corporations. If you look at, for example, the US economy, and I think it's even starker in other countries, but the US is supposed to be the bastion of entrepreneurship. If you divided the economy in half before COVID, you would see about half the GDP and half the jobs in the hands of what is now 31.7 million small businesses, highly decentralized, highly independent, all different geographies and industries and types of entrepreneurs. And then the other half of the economy is concentrated in just over 20,000 large businesses. So it's easier to get compliance and control, and in the case of, politicians' campaign contributions, from the 20,000 businesses that control half the economy than trying to go after the, millions upon millions of small businesses. And around the world, I mean, a small business accounts for 99.9% of all the business entities, not just in the US, but also worldwide. But those ones that are big have that power and the clout and connections and the dollars. And so that's why they get the favorable treatment. And you get this sort of unholy triumvirate of big governments and big corporations and big special interests. And it doesn't work for sort of the average individual.
You do a fantastic job of just sort of laying out the timeline of the pandemic and what we thought at any given time and why we behaved according to what the government told us at any given time. Now we're more than 2 years into it. And you give side-by-side examples of, for instance, a woman retrofits her restaurant to have outdoor seating and gets shut down anyway. But in the same parking lot, a movie studio can have craft services, basically having outdoor dining, just because the government decides who wins and who loses. You talk about how the government could have really done things to help everyday families or small businesses if they wanted to, such as tax credits and things like that. Can you play out what the government really could have done but did not do?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest thing, the way they started, and this goes all the way back to March of 2020. I mean, frankly, we had the data at that point in time that this virus was hurting the elderly and the people who had comorbidity. So frankly, what they should have done is made special efforts to help them quarantine and move safely and let everybody else go about their business. But if they were going to, play this game of shut down, and we're going to shut down these consumer facing businesses with smaller arenas, but just some of them, not the weed store that we own. We're going to shut down the hairdresser. If they were going to do that, then at least in the United States, under the Constitution, we have a principle called eminent domain. And if the government takes your property for the public good, they're required to compensate you. So what they should have done is they should have earmarked a certain amount of money. I estimate, based on the types of businesses that they closed down, they probably could have earmarked $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion in the US, which sounds like a lot, but far less than the $6+ trillion that was spent. And they could have kept those businesses in business. Say, we're going to pay you to shut down for a couple months, and we are going to pay you to pay your employees as if they're employees. So they're still employed. They just get to stay home for a couple of months. Those people are still paying into Social Security. They're still paying taxes. And, to the extent that there were any kind of issues that could have been sorted out at tax time, but they basically could have replaced the revenues of these businesses and allowed them to stay in business and cover their operating costs. And they would have bought themselves 2 to 3 months to make sure that they had all the risk mitigation in place. And we could have gone on doing what, again, a large part of the population did the whole time. I mean, you had people who were working in grocery stores. You had people who were working as first responders. You had people working all over the place. There were no large pools of death that were associated with any of these places. It was the vulnerable population. So if they didn't know what was going on, they could have bought themselves a couple months to really set something up. And then, we would have taken care of those property rights, and we would have moved, along with our business. But that didn't happen. They used it as an opportunity to basically undertake the biggest wealth transfer in history with the government decisions, not only of shutting down these small businesses, but having, the central banks print all of this money, which inflated asset prices and basically transferred wealth directly from Main Street to Wall Street and the already wealthy and well-connected at the most historical levels that we've ever seen.
Right. And you point out that the businesses that were affected by the Rodney King riots, I think it was $5 billion over 10 years of lost income. So they won't just recover, by next year. We don't even know the impact on small business yet, but we do know the impact on big business. And it's, happy times are here again.
Yeah. And we do know with some small businesses, I mean, June, July of 2020, 400,000 small businesses had been murdered by these mandates. And we know that the president of the United States picked up that number again in January of 2021. So that's pretty solid. I think when it all shakes out, it's probably in the 1 million to 2 million range in the United States alone. And then you have these long tail effects. Unfortunately, my book had to go to publication at some point, so we didn't get to cover all the long tail effects, but we're living with those. The inflation, the broken labor market, the broken supply chains that are all a direct result of the central planning decisions that were made by governments and their cronies at the central banks. And it has completely, again, fallen on the shoulders of small businesses and the average Americans. Those who are big are much better able to navigate their way through this.
I mean, there's been a lot of talk. I mean, you read Jared Diamond's book, Collapse. We talk about this idea of empires crumbling. Certainly, it's been a lot of talk in the past few days. And one of the things you talk about in the book is this idea that the government is too big to succeed. Yeah. And I mean, can we put this genie back in the bottle, or is it? Have we already crossed the Rubicon? I keep throwing out different metaphors here, but how many different Roman metaphors can we throw out? But that's kind of what we're experiencing, right? Can we walk this back? I mean, we saw this in Canada. I mean, hate to keep going on, but we saw this with Justin Trudeau and Emergencies Act this past week, right? We're done. We've removed the blockade. But you know what? I like this extra power that I had. So I'm just going to extend this amount of extra power that I have for another 60 days, 90 days, and could be in perpetuity. Who knows?
Yeah, the trajectory that we're going on is one of more centralized control and decisions made by the few instead of, freedom and choice of the many. And that is not something that works out well for anyone except for those few who are in that inner circle. Certainly, there's always some way to fix it. I just don't know if we have the fortitude to be able to really fix these structural issues without, and I hate to say this, and I don't mean to be pushing this, just being realistic, but without some major civil uprising or war or something that presses the reset button, the things that need to be done in terms of tearing down the purview and the spending of the federal government, returning power to the states in the United States, reining in the central bank, the Federal Reserve, and other central banks throughout the world. Now they're trying to push a central bank digital currency. I mean, that is just, movement in the opposite direction. Everything that, you're seeing now is moving us, more away from this freedom and choice, economic freedom, wealth creation opportunities for everyone to participate in something that looks, much more tyrannical. And it's just, it would take a ton of fortitude to really dial that back in a meaningful way.
Right. And I like how you point out that this is not a problem with capitalism. So people who like to just print it on t-shirts or say that they're against the patriarchy because of capitalism, it's a fundamental lack of understanding of economics and central planning, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the biggest, if you're going to focus on inequality, which has its own issues and could be its own discussion, but let's call it unearned inequality. The biggest driver of unearned inequality is the governments around the world. They're the ones that have created the backdrop that has transferred wealth, both through the central bank intervention as well as the rules and regulations that they have pushed. And so if they were really concerned about righting that ship, and if you're somebody out there who's concerned about that, you'd be getting the government out of the way and creating more opportunities for everybody, because that the government is not the creator of opportunities, they're the creator of barriers to opportunity. And unfortunately, you're getting these people who are actually fairly savvy, the ones who want more central planning and more control, and they are bastardizing the language around capitalism. So they're saying, oh, well, this is late stage capitalism and we need stakeholder capitalism. We need all capitalism is just a very discrete thing. It is freedom, choice, and opportunity of many done with transparency and the guardrails of property rights, versus forced coercion, control, choices by the few, usually done with opacity. So freedom and choice, there aren't stages, there aren't different versions of them. It is what it is.
Ridiculous when you put it that way.
Right.
Yeah, it's a spectrum. So we're either moving towards that or we're moving away from that. And we have, over time been moved, kind of this march, particularly in the United States, have been moving away from that. And now, over the last couple of years, it's just accelerating at a really rapid pace, kind of like that snowball that builds momentum.
Yeah.
Well, our guest has been Carol Roth. The book is excellent. It is called The War on Small Business, How the Government Used the Pandemic to Crush the Backbone of America. We could probably spend another 40 minutes, a couple hours talking. We'll have to have you over for dinner. We will dive deeper into all of this. It's an excellent book, and I encourage all of our audience to go out and read it. It will be one of those books that you will not want to put down.
It's just, it sets your hair on fire because, like I said, I was one of those who's like, yes, keep your hair salon closed. That's the right thing to do. And then you read really the trajectory on what we've all been through, and you're like, that's not right. So I really appreciate this take on it, and you'll need a palate cleanser after this book because it will just make you so mad.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me. Would love to keep continuing the dialogue. And if you really want to be startled, when you get a chance, check my Twitter handle. I'm Twitter at Carol J.S. Roth, and do a search for my name and biggest lie. I ask people, what's the biggest lie we've been told in the last 2 years? I have thousands and thousands and thousands of responses, and just to read it, you will just go, wow, okay, like now I really get where we are and what's going on in the world just by the number and the depth of the types of lies that we've been told. I think it's very eye-opening. So when you have some free time and you really want to be jazzed up and very happy, go read that thread.
Yeah, I love your Twitter feed as well. I mean, I follow you on Twitter, and I love your commentary. A lot of the things that we cover here on this show, it's great to see. There's a few voices out there, and you've got a very loud and very strong voice. So keep doing what you're doing and keep bringing attention to this. This is it's great work that you're doing.
Thank you, guys. Really appreciate both of you.
Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.